So I think right now one of my favorites is like, and I think what people seem to respond best to in my Twitter posts is the notion of scale. Like what is it that drives scale? Because when you think about it, like the tactics that small companies do are generally the same tactics that big companies do. The big
Right.
companies generally just do them a hell of a lot better, or they build kind of systems around those to allow them to scale. So instead of, if your content program is like, I'm going to write 50 blog articles a month, they're writing a
Mhm.
thousand blog articles a month, and then they have a similar system for how they, optimize that from an SEO perspective. So everything is about um, kind of, and it's kind of a combination of like us having a system for something that is scalable and understanding like where your key point of leverage is. So maybe, I know you need some sound bites here. Maybe just to say in simple terms, like identifying your highest points of leverage is like key. Um, at any point, a company could be doing anything to try and grow, right? And everybody knows like, okay, these are all the growth tactics that are out there at my disposal. Most startups, or like if you're a DTC company, you're going to think, all right, I'm going to go to Facebook and run some ads, or I'm going to go to TikTok and run some ads. But it's really like, is like, where's the point of leverage there? So the universe of your advertising is not a single channel, and so you have to figure out like what channel gives me the most leverage. And generally people choose those two because they're well understood. You get the leverage of an algorithm that works very effectively, especially on Facebook. um, and there's not many other. It's kind of like a well trodden path, right? And so, but let's say you also do television advertising. You may be like, it doesn't make any sense for me to be advertising on Facebook because television is 10x the scale or whatever it might be. And but then you have to find the approach on television that would actually work. And so it's going to be a very different thing on Facebook. And so they're both potentially massive opportunities, but assessing the work involved to take advantage of that point of leverage is kind of half the battle, I think.
How do you do that?
Um, you have to you have to do some initial tests to understand. You do research, you do tests, you see what the competitors are doing. I think learning from your competitors, like at the end of the day, you're taking a bunch of inputs and you're trying to make a probability weighted bet that my time is best spent in this way. So let's say it were SEO, you would do a ton of keyword research and you would say, okay, this is what I think the universe of my niche is. And so from there, you can try to extrapolate, well, if we scale the hell out of this thing, our ceiling is going to be around here. And then you say, all right, well, to do that, we're going to need backlinks, we're going to need content, we're going to need technical components. And so there has to be a cost, in labor and money to that. And then you say, okay, you combine all these factors, and then ultimately you're going to say, this is high leverage, but it's an incredible amount of work. This is a similar amount of leverage, or maybe slightly less even, but it's super easy to execute. So let's do that. Um, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Um,
Cool.
let's tackle. So this was scale is realizing where leverage lies in each part of your company. Is there anything else you want to add to this lesson?
Yeah, I think because what's been awesome for me to experience is like scale isn't just like spending more ad money on different platforms. It's like making your product better. It's getting better insights from your data science team. It's improving the technology that you use. It's improving the systems and the way that people behave at their jobs. And so you could do your marketing entirely the same, but let's say you reduce your load time of your website by 90%. Like you're going to see a material benefit for that. And so user experience could be uh, the biggest point of leverage since everybody goes through that touch point, or perhaps there's some technical component that if you solve that, these days there's a lot of algorithmic driven businesses. So we have a recommendation engine that matches people with financial advisors. And so if we can do that 10x more effectively than somebody else, that is like a massive point of leverage, a way that we can effectively deliver a better experience for our users. So my at the end of the day, like, leverage exists in every part of the company. It's just um, understanding how that works and fits into like your overall machine.
So if you were to tell your younger self, maybe 5 years younger self, something about scaling advice, what would you tell yourself?
Yeah, I think I lacked the vision to understand what a large company, like what was important at scale. Because I joined this company 7.5 years ago. I had very little really scaled experience at that point. So it's been an education the entire way. And so I was still in this very narrow minded frame of like, I had a team of me, and then I started adding people. Now we have a pretty robust team, but it was widening the aperture to understand like these are not tactics. A tactic is like a crumb within a strategy, and a strategy um, is an option among many strategies. And instead of just like rushing headfirst into the next shiny object or what sounds good or what your boss thinks is good, like take the time to actually think about what are the few dials that if we get control of them are actually going to move the business. And I think this is an important point. I mean, I feel like I learned this way too late. And one of the problems is that people that come up with informal digital marketing first training, like, I mean, or experience or jobs, they don't really have formal training in how to think about how they operate. You have to seek out, whether it's on Twitter or a course like Reforge or something like that. You really got to figure out like what is the big picture here. Nobody's, when you're like the only guy at a startup doing marketing, nobody's there to teach you the big picture. And so I think one of the lessons for me is it's just like compounded. It's just made me so much more effective to like have the impact that we need to have, while also not running around like an idiot with my head cut off, like trying to do a million things that really aren't going to make a difference. I remember my first year, we were working on Christmas Day trying to get this thing out. And in retrospect, it generated like no revenue. And it was like, it should have been obvious to us that it wasn't going to generate any revenue, but we had this like frantic uh, sense of like, commitment, but a lack of perspective, I think.
Well, it's easy to say in hindsight that of course we should have known that this is not going to work, but how can you know upfront whether something is going to work or how well is it going to work?
Yeah. I think it comes back to probability weighted like modeling around outcomes. And if we had been realistic about the this particular situation, like I think it was evident that the amount of traffic that we were expecting this effort to receive would have resulted in a disappointing outcome. And that's not always the case. That's one of the luxuries of having funding is that you can um, there is a good bit of trial and error to it, and you aren't always going to know like what the payoff is. Ironically, what is now our primary business, this two-sided marketplace for financial advisors, this started as a lark. It was like a side project that our CEO gave to one of our junior product managers, and they were like, "Hey, go spend some time researching this. What might an MVP look like, and let's see if anything comes from it." And so those are the kind of like explorations that you always got to be doing, and you got to be able to have the patience and the money to let those either peter out or show their value. So
How long did it take for that MVP to show promise that this is making money?
Well, I think it showed promise a long time before it made money. Because so the initial question we were trying to answer was, here you have a really high. It's a very like important decision. Like, who are you going to give your money to, and like your trust, like all the money you've spent your life earning, like you want somebody to protect that. Like, were people willing to form a relationship through like an online lead generation service, especially back then, um, or would they just find that too unsettling? And the answer was, yeah, they were willing. There was Google traffic for it, and so the way that we approached it was we said, okay, let's get in front of the people who are actively saying, financial advisor near me, and see what the response is. Is our conversion rate 1%? Is it 50%? Like, and so it became clear that there were people searching for this online, and there wasn't a good alternative. So that's when the promise was evident, and then monetization took some time because a good marketplace, you need thousands of options to provide great recommendations for people. And so initially, we just had one or two kind of aggregators that were paying us a fraction of the value of what we were generating, but we were able to at least get benchmarks around like, okay, assuming that things go right and we can convince X, Y, and Z companies to test with us, this is what roughly where we would need to be to get ROI positive. So,
Another lesson learned that you have is the value of asking what would have to be true.
yep. So I think this is something I picked up from Twitter. This phrasing, and
It's a Roger
and
Martin original.
what's that?
It comes from Roger Martin, the strategy thinker. He wrote a
Oh,
book
okay,
about it.
great. Yeah, I didn't realize that, but Twitter's full of recirculated,
Sure.
regurgitated advice.
Mhm.
But because one of the big problems that I see in thinking about anything is that we are very like beholden to our current perceptions of like what is possible, and the constraints that we deal with on a daily basis. And so within a startup, you know that the constraints might be like bandwidth, they might be money, they might be resources of one kind or another. And so a lot of people default to this view of, well, of thinking like why things are not possible because, oh, we've got these problems or we've got these constraints. And I have never seen that approach really yield, like, I don't want to say anything, but I would say, you're looking for big incremental gains. You're looking for like those stepwise improvements. Um, and so I prefer the approach like, because I'm a creative guy and I love to think like, and I think that's why entrepreneurship and building stuff appeals to me because you're just saying, you're kind of like forcing your will on the world and saying this stuff does not exist, or we're not doing this way yet, but it's possible. So let's figure out how the hell to do it. And I find that somebody else said like building goals from the ground up is kind of arbitrary and limiting. And so if you say, hey, we're going to do X, then people will do X. But how do you know that they couldn't have done Y? And so I prefer to say, all right, let's say we're at X, like let's get to 10X. So what would have to be true to get to 10X? Like, do we need five more people on this team? Do we need, um, do we need to be producing 1,000 more articles? Like if it were SEO a month,
Mhm.
do we need an ad budget that's like 10 times what our ad budget is? And then again, what you can do is you can go back to those points of leverage and say, okay, well, what are the points of leverage that relate to this goal? And then you could say, all right, well, one is conversion rate. So let's say we get halfway there by doubling our conversion rate. Okay. And then another one might be like, okay, we'd have to double the lifetime value of a customer. So already you're closing that gap. Um, Whereas if you're just kind of looking at the things in front of you, you might be like, well, we have these shitty ideas and we have these lame constraints. I would much rather go to the CEO and say, hey, this is what we want to achieve. It's possible, and this is what we need to achieve it. And from there they can say no.
Another point that you talk about is the internet is larger than you think.
Yeah, I mean the internet is incredibly large, and I think people get in this tunnel vision of. I mean, I probably surf the same like 10 sites a day, and most people I think are like that. And marketers, digital marketers, are very like siloed. It's like you come up with a specialization. It's like you're either on search, you're on you're on social, or you're and the nuances of each platform really kind of create that because you have to spend a lot of time to understand all these nuances. And so when the reality is like these are just different contracts, different pricing models, and different means of acquiring access to people, right? And there's a million. I mean, there's billions of websites, and a lot of them have advertising, and they're not all Facebook, they're not all Google, and many of them are trying to increase their revenue. So it doesn't make sense to go to the long tail and talk to a bunch of no traffic mom and pop websites, but um, there are a lot of other forms of traffic that have been aggregated in some degree, uh, you know, that are not really thought of first, I would say.
Do you have an example or story of when you used one of these, lesser known channels?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the benefits, we started as a tool that, sorry, we started one of the things that one of our initial products before the lead gen platform came around was that we built embedded financial tools for third party publishers. And so our business development team built this amazing network uh, of financial publishers that wanted to improve their monetization. And so we provided tools that did that. And so that created like a footprint of relationships where you could then go to them and say, hey, we have this other way of monetizing, which is through our lead generation platform. Would you find it, are you open to testing that? And so having direct relationships with large publishers is one. There's a lot of other, there are other spaces, like one that I think is really interesting is like newsletters. Um, Most major web publishers have newsletters, and this is, you have companies like Live Intent that have tried to build ad networks around it, but it's not always. When you work directly with publishers, you can often customize the units in a way that is going to be more effective than these type of programmatic units. So those are two examples I would give.
Another lesson learned you have is that at scale, everyone is a competitor.
Yeah. So at scale, everyone is your competitor, and what that means is if you want scale, you have to go to these mass market media channels. So if let's say it's like being on the front page of the New York Times, or like yahoo.com, or some web portal that gets millions of eyeballs a month, but they're very undifferentiated users. These people are like just like CNN.com or something. People are just consuming news, right? And um, you're competing with brands who aren't trying to get an explicit return on their dollar. And so if they're willing to pay more money than you, then you're not going to get the scale on those platforms. But you want to reach the max audience you can to sell as much of your product or service as you can. And so you have to be able to monetize sufficiently, like make as much money per thousand impressions as theoretically a brand is willing to pay, so that you can kind of capture a share of that. There's really two components to this. So like everyone is your competitor in the sense that like when you're a media buyer, like a platform is industry agnostic. Like The New York Times doesn't care if you're selling widget A or widget B as long as you can afford to pay their rates. And you can't afford to pay their rates if the other advertisers are monetizing a lot more effectively than you are. Right. And then the other component of this is that you're just competing for attention with everybody. Like, let's say you are thinking about how to market your podcast. Like, your competition is not just like other podcasts. It's like, what do people spend their time doing? It's watching movies or listening to audiobooks or other things like that. And so I think that's the more interesting component. It's about finding, you know, what makes you worth somebody's time or attention.
So would your advice be to create more pattern interrupt, or what should we do?
Um, you specifically, or a person in
Anybody
general?
who's competing
Anybody?
for attention.
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of it. Like, what we've seen work is like, um, there has to be an element of novelty to get people's attention. And ultimately, the value you provide, if you have novelty without value, then you're just going to waste your money. But there's some arenas where um, you may choose not to compete, but ultimately you have to be differentiated in a key way that like satisfies whatever human need people are after. Um, so yeah, I think it's a complex question, and I don't profess to be like a you know an expert on it, but it's just something that I've observed, and especially within financial services, I think it's one of those industries that, because it's highly regulated, people are things tend to look very similar, and so um, people don't do
Mhm.
a great job of differentiating themselves, disrupting those patterns, and
That's right. Yeah. Sameness is everywhere. And also, one thing that you have learned over the years is don't follow the sheep. What do you mean by that?
yeah, I mean, this is kind of just I've always been a bit of a uh, I don't like to do what um, I don't know. I'm always a little bit skeptical of mainstream thinking. And for example, one thing that seemed very knee jerk reaction is like when Elon took over Twitter, and there was this like big change, or this there was like a perception, like obviously there were changes at Twitter, but none of the journalism I've seen around the fleeing of brands from Twitter talks about like really that the environment, that the ecosystem on Twitter has changed. It's all this fear of the ecosystem changing and these brands like fleeing. Um, and whether that's true or not, it hasn't been true in my experience. But that to me is an opportunity where, um, you know, it reminds me of Warren Buffett saying, where like be greedy when people are fearful and be fearful when people are greedy. Like the prices on Twitter have dropped dramatically for media buyers, and they're offering pretty substantial financial incentives for people to spend more money. And so as a performance advertiser, like that to me is an opportunity. Um, and I think people need to be a little bit more skeptical of the narratives that are guiding their decisions. Um, I might have a different opinion if I was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar ad agency that represents brands that have very different priorities or strategies. But I think it goes back also, it ties into like the internet is larger than you think. Like just because every DTC company is on Facebook doesn't mean that's like the only way to scale a DTC company. I think people need to be creative and think for themselves and be, yeah, just don't accept like the standard narratives.